we are getting into this Glenn Greenwald and RFK Jr. story. Now, I have 3 clips I'm going to show from this. Yes, 3 clips I'm going to show from this because Glenn Greenwald has the full interview on Rumble, but on Twitter, he clipped it. And so there's different clips on, not Twitter, on YouTube, he clipped it. So there's different clips on YouTube, but the full length video is on Rumble. So just FYI, right? The first topic that we're going to dive into is Russiagate. Because for those who are not aware, apparently RFK Jr. did believe the Russiagate, theory that, Trump had colluded with like Russia. Apparently he has changed his view on that now. And I want to get into that topic first. And they kind of lead into like the Ukraine war. But I was kind of surprised with this interview because, like I said, this is the first interview I've seen RFK Jr. do where I felt there were certain parts where he just appeared to be uncomfortable. I'm not faulting Glenn Greenwald or anything like that. I just think it was obvious to me there were some questions that I think made him a little bit uncomfortable, and I think you'll see that. But let's get into the Russiagate topic first.
You seem to me to be a kind of vehement supporter of Russiagate. Your campaign contacted me, said they thought that was an unfair characterization. I went back and looked and concluded that at least it was excessive. And I went on the air a couple days later and kind of withdrew that characterization and said there's no need for me to kind of try and describe his views because he's going to be here and I can ask him. So here you are. In terms of this Russiagate narrative that really dominated our politics for 5 or 6 years, and the 2 prongs of it were that the Trump campaign collaborated with the Kremlin to hack into the DNC emails and manipulate the outcome of the 2016 election. And the subsidiary claim was that Trump was some sort of a puppet of Vladimir Putin or controlled by the Kremlin due to blackmail and other leverage. What is your view now about the veracity of those 2 claims?
Well, I think that there was a period, which you're correct about, that I just accepted the mainstream narrative. And, part of that is just my own fault of not being skeptical about it. And part of it also may have been just my natal, bias against Donald Trump, which I was like most Democrats, I was probably just happy to hear anything that confirmed my own notion of Donald Trump. The first time that I had any kind of inkling that that narrative may not be complete or accurate was when I was having dinner with Oliver Stone. And Oliver Stone lives about a half mile from where I live. And he had Cheryl and I for dinner one night, and with his son, Sean, who, who's a podcaster and a political critic. And the 2 of them, I don't know how it came up, but, maybe one of us, Cheryl, I mentioned it, but he scoffed in a way that was very dismissive, and then had a sort of a brief dialogue about, a brief monologue about how there was nothing to that story. And it seemed to me, of course, you're with Oliver Stone, so you think, well, he's a guy who's embracing fringe theories anyway, and you just don't know. But it put the first seed of doubt into my head. And then in 2020, when people started criticizing, including myself, the methodology that was being used to prove the COVID vaccines, I all of a sudden started seeing these propaganda tropes, or these tropes that were appearing all the time, saying anybody who criticizes vaccines is probably a Russian bot or a Russian stooge. So then I started thinking, oh, okay, so here's what they're doing. And it, it may be orchestrated. And then I think at that point I was open to hearing a different story. And then I started seeing the piles of evidence, but I still was neutral on it. I mean, in my mind, the jury was out on this stuff. until I saw, the recent disclosures, the Durham report, et cetera, that showed that that it makes it look like the entire thing was fabricated from whole cloth.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was debunked. It was debunked. Let me tell you something, you guys. I actually never really fell for Russiagate. Part of the reason had to do with the fact that Rachel Maddow was heavily pushing it. Just being honest, I honestly don't think most Americans cared about that or believed that or were paying attention to it. I don't think most people were actually like, oh no, he might be in the mix with Russia. No, I just, yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons I focused on it so much was not necessarily because I thought it was an unfair and baseless conspiracy theory that was being propagated by the U.S. security state and the corporate media, which I do think it was. I thought the much more important implication was it was essentially making it so that it was virtually criminalized, inherently so, for American officials to talk to Russian officials. Michael Flynn almost went to prison for calling the Russian ambassador to talk about U.S.-Russian relations. People were petrified of having conversations with Russians because of fear that it would be used to suggest they were sort of a Kremlin loyalist or a traitor. When I look now at the kind of fervor, the anti-Russian fervor that's driving the war in Ukraine, to me, a lot of it seems to have come from this kind of anti-Russian sentiment that Democrats in particular were encouraged to feed on for all these years as part of Russiagate, going back to 2016 when they blamed Russia rather than the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton for her defeat. I'm wondering if that's something that concerns you, this idea that so many Americans are being taught to view the Russians kind of the way we looked at them in the Cold War as this grave existential threat to the United States, and that in part is what is driving what you described as this bellicose mindset toward Moscow.
The answer to your question is yes. Now I see in some way the Ukraine war, that I see a lot of those, that the Russian propaganda tropes that we were being force fed through the mainstream media, and always, with the source to a U.S. intelligence agent, an unnamed U.S. intelligence agency, which is always suspect. And usually coming out of the Washington Post and the New York Times, which, have these deep almost Mockingbird-like relationships with the U.S. intelligence agencies. And now I see that as kind of the runway to the Ukraine war, that it was all, that we were being propagandized to see the Russians as an existential enemy.
Let me ask you about Ukraine. Just one more question, which is, I'm
gonna get to that question for just a second, but I do just want to say, at least he was one of those people that came around on the issue. There are still some people who still Russiagate, but at least he was one of those people that realized, hey, I was wrong about this. So he did come around. Let's see if he can come around on some other issues. We're getting into the Ukraine discussion now.
You before criticized President Biden the way a lot of people have, that it seems very striking. There's no effort, seemingly, to try and end this war diplomatically. If anything, there seems to be an attempt on the United States to block diplomatic efforts to end this war. Do you think it would have been possible to diplomatically avert the war beforehand or to end it now? And if so, how would you do that?
Yeah, I think it can be ended immediately. To me, it seems clear that Putin did not want this war, that he didn't, even in, when the Donbass voted 90-10 to join Russia, Putin didn't want them. Putin said, no, you stay in Ukraine. And then, he was part of the proposal of the Minsk Accords, which would have left Donbass part of Ukraine and, an autonomous region so that they could protect their Russian ethnic citizens who were then being murdered by the Azov battalion and by the Ukrainian government, and that they could continue to practice their own language and culture. And, but that, I think that's the basis for a peace agreement. And the key part of the Minsk Accords was that NATO would agree permanently, we are not going into Ukraine.
Yep.
Which is an understandable request from Russia, who has been invaded 3 times through the Ukraine. The last time in 41, 1 out of every 7 Russians was killed. And a third of the Russians Russia was reduced to rubble. So of course they don't want an enemy military in charge of the Ukraine. And they made that clear since 1992,
See, this is the piece that most people don't mention, by the way, guys. Most people don't mention that part that what he just mentioned about how Russia has also been invaded.
They took the wall down, and the one request they made, they said, you can put NATO troops in United Germany. We will withdraw 400,000 troops from United Germany, but do not make us a promise. You will not move NATO to the east. And we promised them, yeah, we won't move it 1 inch to the east. Well, we moved it 1,000 miles to the east into 14 new countries, and now we've surrounded and encircled the Russians, and we're treating them like the enemy. And of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, Glenn, the clear evidence that the United States was involved in the 2014 coup that removed Viktor Yanukovych's government, which is a government, Ukrainian government that was duly elected by the Ukrainian people, and that we regarded as too sympathetic to the government of Russia. And so, we pumped $5 billion into the project of overthrowing that government. And then we
It's something that the U.S. continues to do in other countries as well. And what did I tell you? It always has some involvement with the U.S. Sometimes you have to go back a couple of years, but you go back a couple of years, you look, the U.S. was definitely involved. And I think more people need to mention that. A lot of times, even mainstream media, they don't want to mention that part. They just want to make it seem like one day Vladimir Putin woke up and said, fuck these hoes. I'm gonna go out here and just like dive into this country and take things back and do what I want and like take this region and take that region. Like that's what they make it seem like, right? So I think it's important that you mention that piece. Now, the other part about this particular discussion, notice that he said, I think it could be ended immediately. Dr. West said the same thing. Oh, we'd call for ceasefire and peace on day one. Marianne's response was a little bit different in the interview that she had with Kim Iverson. So I think, again, when it comes to this particular issue, I do think RFK Jr. and Dr. West do have this correct. And that's why I asked Dr. West, is there any possibility that he could see like maybe collaborating with RFK Jr. on issues where they do agree, like the anti-war issue? Yes, I said that. I'm sorry, JB. Putin woke up one day and was like, fuck these hoes. Oh, man, I haven't used that term in a long time.
Well, our own government, which is Victoria Nuland, we have her tape on the phone picking the new cabinet. And of course, the Russians aren't going to like that too much. Ukraine is 400 miles from Moscow. And we've already been installing missile systems, Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland that are nuclear capable. When my uncle, in 1962, when the Russians did that to us in Cuba, we would have invaded them. Of course, we would invade them today.
Okay, that is the first segment that I wanted to show you. So I think, he realized he got Russiagate wrong. He said, learned from that. I think his position on the Ukraine war, I think he gets that right, and he wants to end it immediately. Now we're moving on to a different topic. Take a deep breath. If you need to stretch, grab some popcorn, a cup of tea, now might be the time to do that. This topic is Israel-Palestine. So brace yourself for this one. There is a lot of back and forth here between Glenn Greenwald and RFK Jr. You guys, if you've been watching me for a while, I do not agree with his position in reference to Israel and Palestine. But what I liked about this approach here is I felt like Glenn was trying to get him to see the error of his ways, and so to speak, by making the comparison to Ukraine, which he'll get into. So I think that was a good idea that Glenn Greenwald did. And I think that, hopefully RFK Jr. can learn from this. I still want to see him have this conversation with Max Blumenthal, though. I still do. you know? So here we go.
Let me ask you about a recent controversy in which you found yourself, more as a window to understand some of your broader views, which was the praise you originally offered for Roger Waters with regard to his stance on both Ukraine, which he is opposed to in terms of the U.S. proxy war, as well as COVID. He was questioning a lot of the same orthodoxies you were. And then you ended up deleting that tweet where you praised him and made clear that the reason was because he had held views on Israel and Palestine that you didn't share. I want to ask you about the specific kind of divergencies that you have with him on that question. But before I get into that, why was it necessary for you to delete your praise for Roger Waters just because you disagree with him on Israel? Can't you praise him on Ukraine and COVID and then at the same time say, but there are other issues, including Israel, where I have differences? Why did you delete the praise entirely?
That's the same question I have. It's like, notice how uncomfortable he looks here. Look, watch this. Watch this, watch.
Why was it necessary for you to delete your praise for Roger Waters just because you disagree with him on Israel? Can't you praise him on Ukraine and COVID and then at the same time say, but there are other issues, including Israel, where I have differences? Why did you delete the praise entirely?
You see that? So keep your eye on RFK Jr. He doesn't look comfortable here, but here we go.
Well, first of all, the reasons that I praised him was because of his position on the war, his position on COVID, which I thought was very courageous at a time when nobody, and also his position on Julian Assange.
Right.
I disagree, I would say fiercely, with his criticism of Israel, and I'm not, there are enough people who characterize those political differences anti-Semitic that me endorsing him felt like I was buying into that, into something that was abhorrent to me. I really disagree.
What people? See, this is the piece I wanted to know when he said people look at this as who? Who said something?
Of Israel, and I'm not, there are enough people who characterize those political differences anti-Semitic that me endorsing him felt like I was buying into that, into something that was abhorrent to me.
Who felt like RFK Jr. was buying into that because he had that tweet where he supported, Roger Waters? Who? Where did that come from? See, this is the question. I'm nosy, but then also like who? Who had a problem with it? Did lobbyists have a problem with it? Did donors have a problem with it? That's what Sabby is curious about.
I really disagree with I think Roger, like many critics of it, first of all, people who criticize Israeli policy should not be characterized as anti-Semitic. But people who apply a different standard to judging Israel than they would to judging an Arab country, I think then that you've crossed a line there. And I do think that Roger does that. I've now looked at some of his stuff and I think, like I said, I do not think people who criticize that people who criticize Israel policies should not be called anti-Semitic. But I do think that many people who are Israel's critics are applying a double standard.
So just to be clear, when you were interviewed by Crystal Ball on Breaking Points, it became kind of a very talked about interview, particularly the part where she was disagreeing with you about your view on vaccines. We did a segment on this show talking about that interview, and my main critique with her, she's a friend of mine, was that I didn't have a problem with her disagreeing with your views on vaccines. Lots of people do. She described it, though, as a red line, which seemed to me her way of saying, I don't disagree with you here, but you're so far beyond the pale about an issue that I regard as so sacred that the fact that that I disagree with you here means you're basically off limits, like you're radioactive, you're not susceptible to consideration for support no matter what, in a way that, say, Joe Biden wouldn't be. That's the impression I got when you didn't just disagree with Roger Waters on Israel, but deleted the praise, namely, doesn't matter how much I agree with him, I regard him as a person who's so radioactive that he should never be praised under any circumstances because of his view on Israel. That's a red line for me. Is that essentially what motivated your deletion in how you view people like Roger Waters and those who share his views on Israel?
Body language is important to me. It's something that I tend to pay attention to. While this has no volume, watch RFK Jr.'s body language. Watch this. Here we go. So right now, he's chill, praised under any circumstance because of his view on, see, watch this, the ear and the shift. You see that? I told you I pay attention to body language.
No, not at all. In fact, I continue to admire Roger Waters for his positions on, for his courageous positions on the Ukraine, on Julian Assange, on COVID. But, because of that issue is so sensitive and radioactive to people, I did not want to leave any opportunity for people to misunderstand. Since apparently, I guess, as I understand it now, he's more well known for his anti-Israel position than probably any other position.
I would say that Roger Waters is more well known as a member of Pink Floyd. Most people, especially those not following politics at all, don't know this. Like, it just, I'm sorry. But the thing is that's who most people know Roger Waters for. They know him for being a member of Pink Floyd, not about his political views, like his view on Israel, Palestine, or his view on this war, Russia, Ukraine. Most people, especially those that are not tuned into politics, aren't paying attention to any of that. So that I think that RFK Jr. is making this bigger than what it actually is. He's making it seem like it's bigger than what it is. Just saying. Let me put it to you this way. People in the hood have no idea this shit is happening. Okay. I'm just telling you right now. If I were to reach out to family members of mine and I say, hey, did you know that they're coming after Roger Waters because da da da? First response we get, Pink Floyd? That's what they know. Most people aren't even following this.
And so praising him without making really clear what I was praising him for, and that I did not buy into his other stuff, was a source of confusion to people that I did not want to leave up there.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the reason why he's most known for that is sometimes the same reason you're most known for your views on vaccines, even though you have views on lots of other things, which is because a lot of times people look for ways to take establishment critics and kind of render them radioactive by focusing on the one issue they know people will be most hostile to. But let me ask you about the substance of the Israel position. You alluded to the fact that your family had long been supporters of Israel. That was kind of the standard Democratic Party position for a long time, still is. At the same time, Israel has clearly changed over the years. The demographic shifts in the population have made it a much more religious society, more right-wing society. And I think any honest observer in the region or anywhere acknowledges that a two-state solution, the kind of way that people justify defending Israel, is now essentially impossible. There's way too many settlements in the West Bank, and those people are never moving, those settlers. You'd need a civil war between the government and Israel to do it. From the position of someone who's running for U.S. president, would your view be that the U.S. should continue to provide billions of dollars every year in aid to Israel unconditionally, meaning no matter how they treat the Palestinians, no matter what it is that they become politically, or would you condition that aid on them treating the Palestinians more humanely and more fairly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long and complex question. And I've been to Israel. I've visited specifically Palestinian settlements within Israel and in, however you want to call it, West Bank or Judea and Samaria. I've been visited. I've spoken with government officials there. I understand that Palestinians are mistreated in Israel. I've seen, the water allocations that were very, very unfairly allocated to the new settlements rather than to traditional settlements that have been around in some cases for hundreds of years.
It's not even just mistreatment, though. Palestinians have been beaten. They've been dragged out of their homes. They've been killed. Don't forget the Palestinian journalist that was killed. Like, it's not even just, I don't even want to use the term mistreatment because it just, that's vague to me. Like, I want you to say specifically what is happening to the Palestinian people. They're being beaten, some of them being tortured, some of them being killed, dragged out of their homes, people taking their homes and saying, you don't live here anymore, get out, and this is mine. So I think, just saying mistreated, that's just such a general term. And that can mean different things to different people, especially for people who are not familiar with everything that's happening over there to the Palestinian people.
In terms of the evolution, I think everything has a historical context in Israel. And if you look at why we don't have a two-state solution in Israel, which everybody now says they want, but both in 1947 and 1948.
And that's not true. Everybody is not saying they want a two-state solution. That's the thing.
1947, 1948, and then again in 2001, it was the Palestinian leadership that walked away from a two-state solution and pledged itself to the destruction of the Jewish people. Oh, and that, that's a very, very clear history. And I think at a time when they had a very, very generous solution on the table. Now,
so it's the Palestinians' fault? Does anybody notice what's wrong with the rhetoric here?
The thing I say is Israel is a democracy, but it's a flawed democracy, just like the United States. But if I was a dissident Arab Palestinian, would I rather be a dissident in Israel or in Saudi Arabia or Oman or Qatar or any other Arab nation? If you're a dissident, you get up in the middle of the public square and denounce the government. Where would you rather be? You'd rather be in Israel. It's the only place you're not going to get in trouble. And that does not mean that it's a perfect democracy. It isn't. It's very, very flawed. And I do not, I differ vociferously with the views of the right-wing, religious right-wing groups that have in many ways been dictating policy in Israel over the last few years. I think part of the responsibility of the United States is to try to find a path to justice for the Palestinians. But on all these issues, if you live on any of these other countries.
I'm sorry, I have to comment on the town square part where he says, get up and stand up in front of the town square and tell them that you'd rather be in Israel. Do you want these people to be killed? Like, I don't understand this. Like, no, if anything, a lot of them are trying to be as less visible as possible. RFK Jr. is like, well, get up and stand in front of the town square and say, I'd rather live here. It's like, obviously, they know that. They know they want to be there. They don't want them there. They don't want them there. I don't know how else to say it. Like, I just really don't. Like, to me, this is bizarre. Like, I can't get this out of my head right now that he thinks it's just that simple. And he would even say that.
You're gay, for example. You can be killed for that. Israel is the only place where you have freedom. If you're a transvestite, if you have other kind of dissident views, you'd much rather be in Israel than any other place.
I get that argument,
right, but apparently it's not free to certain people, though. It's not free for the Palestinians. It's not free for the Ethiopian Jews, and I've shown you videos about how they're being treated in Israel as well. It's not. It's like you have this freedom for certain people. For certain people, just like same as like the United States. At one point in time before I was born, there were certain laws in this country and certain freedoms for certain people, and not even just racially. Even when you look at gender, there were certain laws, certain things in this country that at one point in time women could not do. So the whole thing to me is just like, yeah, there's freedoms, but they're for certain people. So he brought up the LGBTQ stance. I don't know if he thought like that would go well with, I don't know what he's thinking. He's like, let me throw this in for an example. Glenn would understand. And I'm just like, no.
Go
ahead. You can finish. Well, I just wanted to ask you quick.
Israel, and we need to have the same standard for judging Israel as we judge other Arab countries. We should, and Israel is.
Who are we giving money to? RFK Jr.? Who's the money going to?
It is going into the West Bank and killing children. It's never doing that deliberately. Never. And nobody has ever said it is.
Well, a lot of people have.
So it's an accident. So what about the Palestinian journalist? I mean, I told you his view on this issue was not good, but I think in this particular interview, it's revealed even more.
A lot of people have said it. A lot of people have said it is. But let me just ask you, because I just want to focus the.
In all of those other countries, it is the deliberate policy of those countries to attack and target civilians and to kill them.
Okay, so let me just.
And I usually don't like people interrupt, but I understand why he's interrupting here. Just because it is not a specific policy, just because it's not written into law, does not mean it is not happening intentionally. Come on, man. Like we got to think about this. RFK Jr. was born way before I was. We got to remember that RFK Jr. grew up in a time in this country. Let me think back. If he's 70s, he's 70s. Okay, yeah. He grew up in a time during the time in this country when parts of the country were still segregated by law, but then there were parts of the country that were segregated not by law, but those things were still being implemented. It didn't have to be a policy written down. What is it? Really? Come on, man. Like, even going back to the Kennedy family, there was a time in this country where you had Klansmen hanging Black people. Now, it wasn't written in policy, but it still happened. And they were getting away with this shit. So come on, you can get away with it. It doesn't have to be a policy. Give me a break. I can't.
I just want to focus the question, though, because you have the kind of abstract question that you're talking about, which is who's better, Israel or Saudi Arabia? And I don't think anybody would doubt you'd rather live in Israel than Saudi Arabia if that's, the choice. Just like people say, I'd rather live in Ukraine than Russia. Ukraine seems more democratic to me than Russia. But when it comes to Ukraine, I've heard you making the argument that even though Ukraine might be our ally, even though they might be more democratic than Russia, we have so many people that you speak eloquently about suffering here at home that this is a war we can't afford. So if you were to go around the United States, as you're already doing and will continue to do, and the question is not who's better, the Israeli or the Palestinians. The question is, why are we in the United States transferring billions of dollars of aid each year to a country, Israel, whose citizens in a lot of ways enjoy better standards of living than a lot of the ways American citizens live? What is your argument for why we should send so much money to Israel but not to Ukraine?
Here we go.
Well, I mean, historically, that argument has been that Israel is the model democracy in the Mideast. It's the only democracy in the Mideast. And as a democracy, it's a model for peacekeeping, there's never been a time in history when a democracy has gone to war with another democracy. So
RFK Jr., I think part of his problem is, and I think it's great that he knows history, but I also think it's important for him to think about what is happening right now in 2023. And I don't care. Historically, it was always that we would support them because they're keeping the peace and yada, yada. Okay, it's 2023. I don't see any peace happening over there right now. I don't see any peace happening. So when the US government is continuing to fund them, we are supporting it. We're supporting the efforts that's happening towards the Palestinian people. We're giving them the arms. We're giving them the money. Come on, man. I don't want to hear about what happened in 1945, 1946. He tend to go back in time to all these different decades. It's just like, well, during my father's year, during my uncle's time, actually in the 50s, and then we used to do this in the 60s. It's 2023. Just because something was right historically doesn't mean it is still right today.
I think our policy in the United States should be to support the growth of democracies around the world.
That was the argument for going into invading Iraq. We're going to spread democracy in the Middle East. That's the argument for supporting the Ukrainians, which is the Ukrainians are a democracy and Russia is an autocracy.
There's a difference, and Glenn, I agree with you, and I think I do think there's a difference between what we did in Iraq, which is imposing a U.S. system, which I don't think was really democracy at the point of a gun, and going in a preemptive war, which we've never done in our history, on a pretext in which we lied to the American public about weapons of mass destruction and our policy of assisting an existing democracy in the Mideast that has had a long relationship with our country and a long and supportive relationship with our country. But, I think you raised some important points. I think it probably, at this point in history, Israel is much better able to take care of itself than it was in the past. And we need to look at all those things.
Yes. I think, yes, you need to look at it. Now, I want you to hear what Norm Finkelstein said in reference to the children being killed, because I told you I was not having that. Listen to this. This is from Squirrel. Listen to this. Israel has no policy of killing Palestinians. Listen to what Norm Finkelstein said about this particular situation.
You can decide for yourself whether it's minimum force. When Israel leveled 18,000 homes, how many Israeli homes were leveled? 1. Israel killed 550 children. How many Israeli children were killed? 1. Now, you might say, well, that's because Israel has a sophisticated civil defense system or Israel has Iron Dome. I won't go into that. I don't have time now. But there's a simple test. The test is, what did the Israeli combatants themselves see? What did they themselves say? We have the documentation, a report put out by the Israeli ex-combatant organization, Breaking the Silence. It's about 110 pages. You couldn't believe it. I'll tell you, Amy, I still remember when I was reading it. I was in Turkey. I was going to a book festival. I was sitting in the back of a car and reading these descriptions of what the soldiers did. My skin was crawling. I was like shaking. Soldier after soldier after soldier. Now bear in mind, you want to say they're partisan, the soldiers? Read the testimonies. They're not contrite. They're not remorseful. They're just describing what happened. There's no contrition. These aren't lefties, supporters of BDS. What do they describe? One after another says, our orders were shoot to kill anything that moves and anything that doesn't move. One after another says, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used lunatic amounts of firepower in Gaza.
These were the Israeli soldiers.
The soldiers, they're describing it. One after another says, we blew up, destroyed, systematically, methodically razed every house in sight.
Yeah. So I think RFK Jr. needs to see that video clip. I think he needs to hear that. And maybe he's probably already been told this before, but for me, man, it's just like, what are you really afraid of? Now, this last segment I want to show is in reference to war with China and his thoughts on that. And I think this is important for people to hear as well.
Let me ask you about China. You just alluded to the fact that we're treating the Russians basically as an enemy. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do you see China in the same way? Do you see them necessarily as an enemy of the United States who needs to be treated as an enemy? Or do you think we can also foster more collaborative or at least less antagonistic relationships with Beijing?
Well, I do see them as an adversary of the United States. I think they're competitive with us, they're ambitious, and they do. The indications are that the Chinese leadership does want to dominate the globe and have access to the natural resources in the developing world. But the worst thing, the Chinese do not want to compete with us militarily. And they shouldn't. I mean, we have 3 times the military budget that they do. We spend more on our military than the next top 10 nations combined. And we have bases we have 800 bases all over the world. The Chinese have 1.5 bases outside of China. So they're not looking for a military competition, and we shouldn't be either. I'm not scared of America competing with China on an economic plane. And I think we should welcome that competition. It would be good for the Chinese, good for the Americans, and good for the rest of the world. We should welcome that and we should de-escalate the military confrontations, take the pressure off of China and Taiwan, de-escalate that controversy and let them figure it out for themselves. And let's compete with them. Let's close most of those bases, bring the money home, get the peace dividend, rebuild our industrial base, and have an economic competition against the Chinese that's friendly, that's congenial, but that's vigorous and robust. And I'm not scared of that. I'm not scared that America cannot outcompete China head to head on economic issues.
One of the flashpoints, obviously, but
so there was a little bit of, I saw some of the comments in the chat. People were like, here he goes with the China stuff. But I agree that the bases around the world do need to be closed. I've been agreeing with that for a long time. Like the 800, I think it's like 800 bases now need to be closed around the world. I can get behind him on that. But to the point that Leroy made about looking at it through a capitalist lens, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. He's thinking about this in reference to healthy, competitive, competition through capitalism. Like, yeah, we should welcome this competition and da-da-da. And it's like, at the end of the day, I mean, China is doing things there. China has issues, but China is doing things that I can only dream of us doing in this country, which is trying to find ways to eradicate poverty, right? To wipe out poverty in this country. I would love to do that. But I know, I would not want to go to war with China. I agree with him on that position. But it does seem like it's really interesting to me when we talk about competition and why China is in the place that they're in. Part of that has to do with the fact of NAFTA. We have to remember it was Bill Clinton. It was Bill Clinton who was the one who started NAFTA, where he sent American jobs overseas to countries like China. So, I mean, I feel like now it's like the U.S. government wants to penalize China for being too successful. How dare you get another bank? How dare you move up the ladder? But we're the ones who sent the jobs there.
Between the U.S.-Chinese relationship is Taiwan. The peace has been maintained between the two countries based on this one China policy that said everybody recognizes Taiwan as part of China, but the U.S. would maintain strategic ambiguity in the event of what it would do if China invaded Taiwan and tried to physically control it. Biden, on several occasions, whether planned or otherwise, seemed to have abandoned that 5-decade-old posture of the U.S. government by saying, no, I absolutely would use military force in order to protect Taiwan in the event the Chinese invaded. Do you think that China would actually invade Taiwan if we did what you recommend, namely kind of de-escalate, pull back a little bit from surrounding their country with all the bases we have? And what would be your posture if asked what you would do if China did invade Taiwan? Would you maintain this ambiguity, or would you agree with Biden to say, no, we would absolutely go to war with China to stop them?
Well, that strategic ambiguity only works up to the point of invasion. So once they invade, then your policy is no longer ambiguous. Strategic ambiguity, I think, is the best posture for the United States, and I intend to maintain it. So I'm not going to tell you what I would do on this, TV show and lose that advantage. I don't think the Chinese want a military confrontation with Taiwan. Taiwan is armed to the teeth, and it's been preparing for 40 years for a war with China if there's an invasion, to repel an invasion. And it would be a catastrophe for China and the rest of the world if Taiwan went to war and we lost the source of a lot of our computer chips and many of the electronics that are now used in Taiwan that are absolutely vital to our industries. The Chinese have the same dependence. So I don't think the Chinese want to go to war with Taiwan. They may exert pressures to have a greater degree of reunification like they did with Hong Kong. But, I think we should try to let them settle it on their own before we start making military threats and rattling sabers, which I think just makes it more difficult for everybody and makes it more likely that we'll end up in a military confrontation.
So I hear what he's saying about letting them handle this on their own. Stay out of this. Don't get involved. But it's still funny to me when people talk about this conflict because they talk about it as though Taiwan is not a part of China. Taiwan's a part of China. It just kind of reminds me of someone saying Washington, D.C. is not a part of the United States. Washington, D.C. is a part of the United States. It's just, I don't know. That's why this whole conflict with China and Taiwan is just weird to me. I'm like, what do you mean? People talk about it as though China, Taiwan is not a part of China.
I think you answered this question in the previous answer, but I just want to be very clear about it because I'm super interested in it, which is you described the way in which you thought, and I think clearly it's true, that the U.S. has been provoking Russia, kind of expanding NATO right up into its borders, right on the most sensitive part of their border, changing their government, the democratically elected government, from a pro-Russia to an anti-Russia government. Imagine if the Chinese did that to a government in Mexico while arming them, all the other analogies that you pointed out in the way that we're kind of encircling Russia, making them more aggressive and paranoid. Do you think we're doing the same thing when it comes to China with all of these bases we're putting in Guam and Australia and South Korea and the Philippines, including nuclear tipped missiles, sending B-52s that are nuclear capable? Do you think a lot of what is happening is that the U.S. itself is being provocative unnecessarily?
Yeah, I think it's the same people. It's the neocons in the White House and the State Department who want a war with China. I don't think they're ambiguous about it. They believe that the United States should use its military force while we still have this incredible superiority to dominate the globe with violence. That is the entire philosophy of the neocons, and I think it's been a catastrophe. Every venture that they've brought us into has been a cataclysm, and a China war will be the end of the world.
Without question.
And they don't even care. They do not.
And they don't even care. So I'm totally glad he's not down for that. But yeah, just a really interesting conversation. If you want to see that full interview, you will need to check that out on Rumble, because on YouTube, he actually just put different sections up, and I only saw 3 when I checked it again today, but the full version is on Rumble. Oh man, what a heated conversation. Oh man, when I did see when Glenn announced on Twitter that RFK Jr. was coming on, I was like, oh boy, I hope he's ready for this one, because I think Glenn asked really good questions, and like I said, that's the first time I saw RFK Jr. appear a little bit uncomfortable compared to other interviews I've seen him ask. I still I want him to have that conversation with Max Blumenthal about the Israel-Palestine issue. Martha said RFK needs to keep hearing from more people about the truth of Palestine. Yes, a discussion with Max Blumenthal also needs to happen. 100%. 100%. Oh boy. Blunts and Otters. Cornel West said he hasn't even talked to Bernie since he announced his run. That should be an interesting conversation. Thank you for the super chat. None of your business. RFK has been living in a tunnel. He is totally uninformed about the world. He should already know this stuff. Knows less than Trump. Yeah, I feel like he just keeps referring back to history. Like I totally get what happened in the past, but just because it was okay in the past doesn't mean it's okay right now. If that were the case, like a lot of the laws that we had back then would still be in place today. And thank you for this as well. So far, I am very disappointed. I'm sorry, none of your business. Thank you for the super chat. Oz, RFK Jr. obviously wrong on this issue. He's toast. Thank you, Matilde. Taianism is Zeroism. Dwayne says, I watched that interview with Greenwald and I was like, I'm done. I'm sorry, Dwayne. I know you liked him. I know you did. I'm sorry.